Okay, so the next technique that I want to talk about in terms of street photography, this one's really important, and this one is called fly on the wall. Now, as you may be able to imagine, fly on the wall, this technique is about becoming an observer, a natural observer within an environment in with the aim of trying to capture scenes as naturally as possible. So as a photojournalist, when I'm in situations, what I'm often trying to do is trying to capture images where people aren't reacting to the camera. They're not doing anything because I'm there. I'm always trying to capture images as naturally as possible. So I try to be a fly on the wall. Now, how do you do that? It's not easy. That's what I'm going to be covering in this section of the stream. So ideally, you don't want anyone reacting to your presence as a photographer. Now, I'm not making portraits here. I'm trying to capture life as naturally as possible. And so one of the best ways to do this is to try to spend as much time in these locations as possible. Now, for me as a photojournalist, I'm often working in communities that I'm going back to day after day after day. So I'm finding myself in situations where I'm starting to get to know people. I'm starting to get people familiar with me. And when you do that for long enough, people start to forget about you and start to forget about your presence there as a photographer and your camera. And you can start to make natural pictures where people aren't doing anything that's in response to your camera. Now, if you're out doing street photography, a lot of this kind of idea can also transfer into general street photography. Now, you may not be interacting with people very much, but you may be able to kind of blend into the environment. So for example, you might find a really interesting street corner that you think will make a great photo. There might be great light, there might be really interesting composition, and you might find there's a cafe there on the street corner. So you might just sit down, order yourself a coffee, and find a little position there where you can literally just sit there with your coffee and newspaper. And from time to time, if you see an interesting scene, start taking some pictures. And so you're not stood there with a big bag, with a big camera, screaming, I'm a photographer. You're kind of embedding yourself into that community to help you be able to get those natural images. And, that's an important point, that when you're doing street photography, having cameras that are not big is a real advantage. So I normally shoot, at the moment, I'm shooting with a little Canon R5, but I'm not sponsored by Canon. Other brands are available. But one of the best things that you can do is just get one relatively small body camera, ideally a small lens, and then just use those for your street photography. If you have a bag, choose just a regular bag. Don't have a full on photographer looking camera bag. Just have a regular bag, small camera. Sometimes you can maybe wrap it around your hand, around your wrist, keep it down by your side, and just raise it up to your eye when you want to take the pictures. So you're trying to be inconspicuous. You're not being sneaky. You're just trying not to stand out and be, this big beacon of a photographer stood there on a street corner. You're trying to blend in with the people and the surroundings. And if you look at this picture that I've got on screen now, this was another picture taken in Portugal, in Lisbon. And you can see that everything's very natural. This family is interacting with each other, neighbors in the background looking at one another. And at this time, I was using a really small film camera, and I was very unthreatening. I'd been spending a little bit of time in this community, kind of chatting to people through my Portuguese friends and translators that we were working with. And so people knew that we weren't a threat. And so as people relax, they kind of just go back to their normal life, and I could start taking normal, natural pictures. This picture, for example, was taken in a restaurant in Lisbon. And so we were dining at the restaurant. And so we were customers there. And so as part of that, we were moving around the restaurant. We were, in between eating and drinking. And so we'd have our camera with us. And then from time to time, take it out, take some pictures of these people playing instruments in the restaurant, and you could capture a very natural moment that wasn't forced because we're there within the situation. In this image taken in Beijing in China, I'm walking down the street through one of the old alleyways, the old hutongs in Beijing. Now, I just saw this amazing scene where this mannequin is looking over the shoulder of this man reading a newspaper, and the way he tilted his newspaper made it look like this mannequin was reading at it. But this was a completely unexpected moment. But I was reacting to this moment just very naturally. And I wasn't making a big song and dance. I wasn't throwing my camera in the face of this guy. I was making very small movements, natural movements, very quick, taking the picture very quickly, not disturbing the scene too much. So that's really, really important when you're doing photography. You know, don't, if you see an opportunity to make a picture, don't rush over to the scene to make that picture. Small movements, smooth movements, so you're not drawing attention to yourself too much, so you're not catching people's eyes so they recognize that you're taking that picture. You're moving slow, you're moving smooth, and you're getting the picture and then moving on, which is what I did in this particular situation. Same here for this image taken in India, in Kolkata, on the banks of the Ganges River. This man was bathing on the banks of the river. And I wanted to be respectful in that moment, but I wanted to capture the reality of life there. So I saw him bathing. I moved up quietly behind him, made a few frames, and then just moved on. And in that particular situation, he didn't notice that I was taking pictures. But again, it's a case of moving quietly but purposefully. In certain situations, you might be able to take your time. In other situations, you might just have to make a couple of frames, respect the people that you're photographing, and then just move on. So 3 tips for becoming a fly on the wall. First, get to know the people in the areas you are photographing. That is often key to finding those opportunities to making those natural images. But like I said, as you photograph people in the street, work quietly but purposefully. Don't make huge movements, and don't draw too much attention to yourself. In point 3, I say use a smaller camera and lens. Really important. You know, especially some parts of the world, you've got to be careful when you're out taking pictures in the street. Men and women photographers have different challenges when out photographing in the street. So all of this kind of plays into the way that you as a photographer are perceived on the street when you're out taking pictures. Obviously, safety is really important, to keep your equipment small. If you don't feel safe in any situation, leave immediately. Sometimes you might want to take photos with a friend, or at least work with a local person if you're in a new location. I often work with translators or fixers, who are people who help me on assignments, local people who give me local knowledge. And those people are really, really important because often they can watch my back in case, you know, we might be in a dangerous situation, or we might be in an area that might be not safe. It's always good to be with somebody else, whether it's another photographer or a friend, a local person, because that can help you not only be safe, but also it can help you maybe get close to some of these communities that you want to photograph. So like I said, if you want to embed yourself in a community, or if you want to hang out on a street corner waiting for that perfect shot, if you've got a friend with you that you can just hang out with, that can make the whole process much easier and also much more enjoyable. All right, so let's go on to your comments and questions. Let's see who's come in since we did the last comments. Okay, we have a question from Sarah Studio. Question: I love to capture in black and white in streets, so in street photography. How to prepare for it, where to use, where not? Well, your choice between whether you want to shoot black and white or color is really personal to you. I don't think there's, you know, with street photography works in black and white or color. There are many great photographers who work in both doing street photography. So it's really a personal choice to you. I personally am a color photographer, although I did start out doing black and white photography at the very beginning of my career. But now I'm pretty much 100% a color photographer. And that's just the way that I see the world and the way I like to do photography. But for you, that might be black and white. Um, Excuse me. In terms of preparation, perhaps you're a film photographer, you need to prepare your film, you need to think about how much film you're going to be shooting throughout the day. That might be one of the things that you might take into consideration for preparing for doing black and white photography, perhaps. But you also might want to think about the lighting conditions, the weather conditions, the mood of the scene that you want to photograph, because black and white photography and color photography can often communicate the same scene in a very different way, or the same story in a very different way. So it really depends on you, the photographer, about what you want to communicate with your photography. And that will determine whether you choose to photograph using black and white or color photography. Okay, we have a question from Jim. Jim Scott Photography. Hi, Jim. Jim is on my mentorship program. So, welcome, Jim, to the live stream. Jim asks, when shooting street or photojournalism type images, do you pre-visuals or do you do pre-visuals or have a theme in mind before heading out, or just react? Yeah, that's a good question. I think for photojournalism, when I'm going out to take photographs, I'm obviously working on a particular story. Now, that might be related to environmental issues like my work, or I might be doing an assignment for a magazine or publication. So before I go out, I will have an idea of the visuals that I want to capture. Now, that might be based upon ideas that I've seen other photographers do. And I think, well, they've done it this way, so I want to do it different. So I'm consciously thinking that I'm going to shoot in a different way. Or it may be something based on the writing of the story, the way that the story is going to be written. So I'm thinking about how I want to communicate this story visually. However, what I find is that the reality is that you can have a visualization for a story, but often, especially with street photography, you cannot predict what's going to happen. And often, some of the best photos that you get on an assignment will come from this type of street photography reportage moments that just appear, that you discover while out shooting. So you can pre-visualize and you can go out and get those kind of images that you have in your mind. But actually, I think it's often better for the story if you go out and you just react what's happening rather than bringing too much of your preconceptions to the story, whether that's an idea, a preconception of an idea, or or a visual preconception of a story. Sometimes it's better to just react to what's happening, because often the images that you get from that experience, from that approach, will often be the most unique and often be the most interesting. But also, you want to combine it. If you are doing an assignment, for example, you want to get the images that you need to illustrate the story, for example, for your editors. But you also want to provide them with something new and exciting and different and unexpected. And so I suppose overall it can be a balance of the two approaches. But that's a great question. Thanks, Jim. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Thanks for all those questions and comments and for letting me know where you're tuning in. Keep them coming. I'll keep coming back to them throughout the live stream. Oh, we did have one comment that I had prepared from a YouTube video comment. This was from Peter Newman. He asked, what focal length do you use for street? The photos I see in major publications where there are groups of people in demonstrations and political meetings, for instance, appear to have been taken with wide-angle lenses, presumably to get as much as possible in the frame. Yeah, good question, Peter. I typically like to do street photography with a 35 millimeter lens. That's my go-to lens. I have for my Canon, I have a prime lens that's 35 mil. And I kind of like that, not just for the viewpoint, but I don't really like to do street photography with a zoom lens. I do it with a zoom lens sometimes, but actually, if you have a fixed prime lens, so you for those who are new to photography, with a prime lens, you can't zoom in and you can't zoom out. So you have a fixed perspective. And the one I like is 35 millimeter because I think that provides you with a very natural view, very similar to what you'd see with your own eyes. And one of the advantages of using a fixed prime lens like the 35 millimeter is that you get very used to that perspective. So you can almost pre-visualize what you will see before you even put the camera up to your eye. And that's really, really useful for these type of situations that photojournalists and documentary photographers are reacting to, like Peter mentions, in demonstrations, political meetings, this type of thing, where you're working really quickly, you're working really fast. Being able to pre-visualize that scene before you even put the camera to your eye and kind of assessing, is this a moment that I want to capture? Is that the moment that I want to capture? What will it look like from here? You see it in your mind's eye because you're so used to using that one type of lens. So 35 mil is my preference. Some photographers like to go a little bit wider, 28. Some photographers like to go a bit tighter with a 50 millimeter. It's a bit too tight for my tastes. But every photographer is different. But my personal preference is a wider 35 mil because, like you mentioned, Peter, that gives you a good field of view, quite wide, so you can frame lots of different things within your frame, play around with the composition a bit more. And I just find that's the most natural perspective for me.